No one would buy the fat Amish girl, abandoned without clothes at auction until the mountain man. The church bell tolls. Dust swirls on the auction block. A trembling Amish girl stands exposed before a crowd that laughs and jeers. The sheriff sneers, ready to drag her to jail. But then, boots thud against the boards. A mountain man, scarred by loss and silence, pushes through the crowd. With a single silver coin and a stare colder than steel, he throws his coat across her shoulders. The crowd falls silent. But what seems like rescue is only the beginning. Because the girl carries more than shame. She holds the key to land the railroad is desperate to claim. And those who mocked her aren't done yet. As storms rise in the mountains and betrayal cuts close to home, mercy and faith become their only weapons. Will the girl everyone scorned find the strength to stand tall? Or will the greed of powerful men strip her of everything once more? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The late autumn wind cut through the muddy streets of the Colorado mining town, carrying the stench of coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Rough men in threadbare coats clustered around the wooden auction platform, their faces ruddy from drink and the biting cold. Miners with coal-stained hands stood shoulder to shoulder with weathered farmers and bleary-eyed saloon hands, all drawn by the spectacle about to unfold. Ruth Ann Stoltzfus stumbled as her uncle's harsh grip propelled her forward. Her plain black dress and white prayer cap marked her as different from the frontier women in their calico and shawls. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, silently reciting psalms as she'd been taught since childhood. "Got me a strong back for sale," her uncle bellowed, his voice slurred with whiskey. "My brother's girl here, good for work, if nothing else." He yanked at her dress sleeve, tearing the fabric to expose her shoulder. "See? Sturdy enough for any man's needs." The crowd's laughter stabbed at Ruth Ann's heart. She crossed her arms over her chest, trying to hold the torn fabric together as her uncle continued his cruel display. Her cheeks burned with shame as the men's eyes crawled over her heavy-set frame. "The fat Amish girl," someone called out. "Bet she eats more than she's worth." Sheriff Tom Bridger leaned against a hitching post, a tobacco-stained smirk playing across his weathered face. "Ain't nobody gonna bid on damaged goods," he drawled, spinning his revolver lazily. "Especially not one that size." The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man in a stained vest, cleared his throat. "Starting bid at $5 for the girl. Strong back, knows her letters raised proper." When no one stepped forward, he lowered the price. $3? Come now, gentlemen. Surely she's worth that much." Ruth Ann's uncle growled in frustration. "She's got debts to pay. Someone take her or she goes to jail for indecency." He grabbed her arm again, threatening to tear more of her dress. A hush fell over the crowd as a shadow fell across the platform. Ruth Ann looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a giant of a man pushing through the onlookers. His bearded face was half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and his massive frame was wrapped in worn animal furs. Snow melted on his shoulders as he stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like water. This was Caleb Brandt, the mountain man who rarely came to town. Stories about him filled the saloons, tales of battles with bears, of winters spent alone in the high country, of his dead Shoshone wife. His presence alone seemed to steal the very breath from the crowd. Without a word, Brandt reached into his coat and pulled out a silver dollar. The coin glinted in the weak sunlight as he held it up, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's intensity. No one dared meet his gaze. The auctioneer swallowed hard. We have $1 bid from Mr. Brandt. Do I hear?" Brandt's growl cut through the air like a knife. The auctioneer's mouth snapped shut, and even Sheriff Bridger straightened up, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. In 2 long strides, Brandt reached Ruth Ann. She trembled as he towered over her, but his movements were gentle as he unwrapped one of his fur coats and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth and weight of it felt like armor, shielding her from the cruel stares. "She's paid for," Brant rumbled, his voice rough from disuse. He pressed the silver dollar into the auctioneer's shaking hand, then turned to Ruth Ann's uncle. The smaller man stumbled backward, suddenly sober enough to recognize the danger in Brant's eyes. Ruth Ann clutched the fur coat closer as Brant's huge hand settled on her shoulder, guiding her off the platform. The crowd melted away before them, no one daring to meet the mountain man's fierce gaze. Even Sheriff Bridger remained silent, though his eyes narrowed with calculation as he watched them pass. The only sound was the crunch of their boots in the early snow and the distant whistle of a train as Brant led Ruth Ann away from the town's prying eyes. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, feeling the warmth of God's mercy wrapped around her shoulders like the mountain man's coat. Behind them, the town stood frozen in stunned silence, watching as the unlikely pair disappeared into the gathering dusk. The giant mountain man and the Amish girl he'd claimed not as property, but as a person worthy of dignity and protection. The mountain man's horse picked its way carefully along the muddy street, carrying both riders away from the hostile town. Ruth Ann perched awkwardly behind Caleb Brant, her hands clutching the edges of his borrowed fur coat. The jeers of the crowd still echoed in her ears, making her shrink deeper into the warm pelts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rutted wagon road as they headed into the foothills. Wind rustled through the bare branches of cottonwood trees, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called. Ruth Ann's teeth chattered, though whether from cold or lingering fear, she couldn't tell. I know I'm not much to look at," she ventured quietly, her voice barely audible above the steady clip-clop of hooves. "But I can work hard. The non-Amish, they don't always understand our ways, but we learn useful things." Caleb remained silent, but his head tilted slightly, showing he was listening. "I can sew just about anything," Ruth Ann continued, desperate to prove her worth. "Clothes, quilts, even leather work, and I know how to bake bread without store-bought yeast. My mom taught me to keep bees, too. They're God's most interesting creatures, if you ask me." The mountain man gave a slight nod, but offered no words in return. His massive shoulders remained steady as a mountain ridge ahead of them, his attention focused on the darkening trail. As dusk began to settle over the land, Caleb guided his horse off the main road toward a natural bluff sheltered by towering pines. The ground was relatively dry beneath the thick branches, and a tumble of rocks would block the worst of the wind. He dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with surprising quietness for such a large man. Then he turned and held up his hands to help Ruth Ann down. She hesitated, knowing her weight would be a burden, but his strong grip lifted her as easily as a child's doll. "Might help gather kindling," he said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving town. His voice was rough, like boots on gravel, but not unkind. Ruth Ann nodded eagerly. Despite her trembling hands, she set about collecting dry pine needles and small twigs, arranging them carefully as she'd been taught. Her movements were precise and practiced, even in her distress. Caleb watched her work while he unsaddled the horse and set up their camp. Soon a small fire crackled between them, its orange flames pushing back the gathering darkness. From his saddlebags, he pulled out a wrapped package of cornbread and offered her half. Ruth Ann accepted the food with a quiet, "Danke, thank you." Before eating, she bowed her head and began to pray softly in German, her native Pennsylvania Dutch flowing like gentle water. "Herr Gott sei uns gnädig." "Lord God, be merciful to us." The mountain man paused with his bread halfway to his mouth, something flickering behind his eyes as he listened to her prayer. When she finished, they ate in silence, with only the pop and hiss of the fire between them. As the night deepened, Caleb arranged his bedroll for Ruth Ann near the fire, then settled himself against a tree trunk, his rifle across his knees. Ruth Ann lay down, exhausted by the day's trials, and soon her breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep. But Caleb remained awake, his dark eyes fixed on the dancing flames. In their shifting light, he saw another face. Delicate features framed by straight black hair, dark eyes that sparkled like stars. His Shoshone wife, Morning Flower, had prayed in her own language too, though to different spirits. She had been just as gentle as this Amish girl, just as capable with her hands. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. Caleb's shoulders tensed as memories washed over him. The raid that had taken Morning Flower and their unborn child, the helplessness he'd felt, the grief that had driven him deep into the mountains. Now here he was, responsible again for someone else's safety, someone else's life. He glanced at Ruth Ann's sleeping form, noting how she'd curled into herself even in sleep, as if trying to appear smaller. The cruel words of the townspeople had cut deep, he could tell. But he'd seen something else in her today, a quiet strength, a dignity that went beyond appearance. It reminded him of Morning Flower's grace, though the thought brought both comfort and pain. The mountain man settled in for his vigil, his weathered face carved in shadows as he guarded their small camp through the long hours of darkness. The fire slowly died to embers, but still he watched, haunted by the past while keeping watch over this unexpected future. The morning sun brought little warmth to the mountain trail. Ruth Ann's legs trembled with each step, unused to the steep terrain. Her thick, black dress caught on thorny branches, and her practical shoes, perfect for Pennsylvania farmland, slipped on loose rocks. Still, she pressed forward, determined not to be a burden. Caleb walked ahead, leading his horse, occasionally glancing back to check her progress. The path grew steeper, winding through stands of spruce and aspen. Ruth Ann's breath came in heavy puffs, visible in the cold air. Her thighs burned from the climb, and she stumbled more frequently as the hours passed. After her third stumble, Caleb stopped and turned. Without a word, he strode back and lifted her onto his horse. Ruth Ann's cheeks flushed pink, embarrassed at needing help, but grateful for the relief. The horse's steady gait carried her up the final stretch of trail. Near midday, they crested a ridge, and Ruth Ann caught her first glimpse of Caleb's home. The line shack perched on a small, flat stretch of ground, its rough-hewn logs weathered gray by sun and storm. A single window faced east, its shutters hanging slightly crooked. No smoke rose from the stone chimney, and no garden softened the cabin's stark outline against the mountainside. "It ain't much," Caleb said, leading the horse to a lean-to shelter beside the cabin. Ruth Ann slid carefully from the saddle, her legs wobbly. "It's shelter," she replied softly. "The Lord provides what we need." Inside, the cabin was a single room, dark and cold. An iron cookstove squatted in one corner, its surface dusty with disuse. A narrow bed frame held a lumpy mattress stuffed with pine needles. A rough table and single chair completed the sparse furnishings. The floor was swept clean, but the walls needed washing, and cobwebs festooned the ceiling corners. While Caleb went to chop firewood, Ruth Ann found a worn broom behind the door. The steady swish-swish of bristles against the plank floor filled the quiet space. She hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn her mother had taught her. When the floor was clean, she shook out the bedding and arranged it neatly, smoothing the wrinkles with careful hands. The sharp crack of Caleb's axe echoed through the trees. Ruth Ann explored the cabin's meager supplies, finding a few dried herbs hanging from the rafters and some wrinkled vegetables in a root cellar beneath the floor. In a leather bag, she discovered strips of dried venison. By the time Caleb carried in an armload of split logs, Ruth Ann had the cook stove warming and a pot of stew beginning to simmer. She had crumbled the venison into the pot with wild onions and wrinkled potatoes, seasoning it with the dried herbs. "Didn't expect supper," Caleb said, stacking the wood neatly by the stove. "It's what I can do," Ruth Ann answered, stirring the pot. "It ain't fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." When the stew was ready, Ruth Ann served it in Caleb's 2 battered tin bowls. The mountain man took his first bite cautiously, then paused, surprise flickering across his weathered features. The meat was tender, and the broth rich with herbs she had found. He cleaned his bowl without speaking, but held it out for more when she offered. Night fell early in the mountains, bringing with it a rising wind that rattled the cabin's shutters. Ruth Ann had made up her bed in a corner, using quilts she had found in a trunk. Caleb took the narrow bed frame, his long frame barely fitting. The wind grew stronger, howling around the cabin's corners like a wild thing. Ruth Ann pulled the quilts tighter, trying not to shiver. "I'm afraid," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Of the wind?" Caleb asked from his bed. "Of being unwanted again," Ruth Ann admitted. "Of being too much trouble, too, heavy a burden." Her voice caught on the last words. Silence filled the cabin for a long moment, broken only by the storm's fury. Then Caleb's deep voice rumbled through the darkness. "You're safe here." Those 3 words, gruff but certain, settled around Ruth Ann like a warm blanket. She closed her eyes, listening to the first soft patter of snow against the roof. The storm grew fiercer, but inside the cabin the cookstove's warmth held back the cold. Through the night, snow continued to fall, coating the mountain in white drifts. But inside, Ruth Ann slept peacefully, no longer alone in the wilderness, and if Caleb lay awake, watching the shadows dance on the now clean walls of his cabin, he kept his thoughts to himself. 3 days passed in quiet routine at the line shack. The morning sun finally broke through, warming the snow-laden branches until melting drops fell like rain. Caleb watched the valley through his spyglass, checking the path to the trading post. "Trail's clearing," he announced over breakfast, where Ruth Ann was serving hot cornmeal mush sweetened with wild honey. "Need supplies, flour's low, and we're out of salt." Ruth Ann nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I can mind the cabin if you—" "You're coming," Caleb cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Need to know the way yourself." They set out after the morning frost softened. Caleb led his horse down the winding trail while Ruth Ann rode, her hands steady on the reins now. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. Water dripped from branches overhead, and patches of mud showed through the thinning white blanket. The trading post was a weathered building nestled in a small clearing. Rough-cut boards formed its walls, and a tin roof gleamed dully in the midday sun. A few horses were tied to the rail out front, stamping in the slush. Inside, the post was dim and crowded with goods. Barrels of flour and sugar lined one wall, while tools hung from the rafters. The smell of leather, tobacco, and coffee mingled in the air. Ruth Ann followed Caleb to the counter, where he began negotiations for supplies with the gruff trader. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself," a smooth voice cut through their business. A well-dressed gentleman emerged from the shadows, his boots polished despite the mud outside. "And the young lady from the auction block." Ruth Ann stiffened, recognizing the railroad agent who had been watching that day in town. Silas Kerr smiled, but his eyes were cold as he pulled papers from his coat. "Fortunate meeting," Kerr continued, spreading documents on the counter. "Save me a trip up the mountain. Got some business needs attending to?" He tapped a finger on the papers. "Concerning the Stoltzfus Valley property." Ruth Ann's hands trembled. "Our farm?" "What business?" "Simple matter, really. Your uncle signed over the deed last week. Railroad's buying up the whole valley for the new line." Kerr's smile widened. "Just need your signature to finalize things, being of age and all." "My uncle had no right," Ruth Ann's voice caught. "Had every right, as your guardian." Kerr pushed a paper forward. $500 for the lot. Fair price for unworked land." Caleb's hand settled on his rifle stock, but he kept the weapon shouldered. His voice was quiet, but hard as stone. "That valley's been worked 15 years. Good water, rich soil. "Progress waits for no one," Kerr replied smoothly. "Railroad's coming through one way or another. Better to take the money now, girl." Ruth Ann's eyes filled with tears, but she lifted her chin. "That land was my parents' dream. They worked it till the day they died. And now it's railroad property." Kerr's smile vanished. "Sign the papers." Caleb stepped between them, his broad shoulders blocking Kerr's reach. Without a word, he guided Ruth Ann toward the door, leaving the agent calling threats behind them. "Your uncle's signature is binding. We'll take it by force if needed." The ride back up the mountain was silent, except for Ruth Ann's quiet sobs. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the snow-patched valley in shades of gold and purple. "Papa cleared that land by hand," Ruth Ann said, as they unsaddled the horse. "Mama planted an orchard. They're graves." She pressed a hand to her mouth. Caleb secured the horse in the lean-to before speaking. "Sometimes land's worth more than gold." He paused, looking out over the darkening valley. "Worth fighting for." Inside the cabin, Ruth Ann lit the lantern while Caleb stoked the cook stove. The flame's warm glow filled the single room, casting long shadows on the walls. Ruth Ann sat at the table, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "I won't let them take it," she said finally, "even if I must stand before the whole town again, even if they laugh." Her voice grew stronger. "That land holds my family's dreams, their prayers, their love." Caleb nodded silently, respect showing in his weathered features. The lantern flickered, and outside, an owl called into the gathering night. Ruth Ann straightened her shoulders, determination replacing tears in her eyes. "The Lord gives strength to stand," she said softly, "and I mean to stand." The mountain winds howled outside, but inside Caleb's line shack, change whispered on softer breezes. Ruth Ann stood at the rough-hewn table, measuring careful lengths of burlap from a roll they'd bought at the trading post. Her thick fingers moved with surprising grace as she pinned and stitched, transforming the coarse fabric into simple curtains. Caleb watched from his chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. The shavings fell in pale curls at his feet, while Ruth Ann worked. When she hung the curtains, the harsh mountain light softened, casting gentle shadows across the plank floor. "Makes it feel more like home," she said quietly, smoothing the fabric. She didn't expect an answer, having grown used to Caleb's silence. Day by day, the cabin transformed. Ruth Ann arranged tin cans on wooden shelves she'd convinced Caleb to build, sorting dried herbs and precious supplies. The hearth, once cold and empty, now radiated warmth as she baked bread every morning. The yeasty smell filled the small space, making even Caleb's stern expression soften when he came in from chopping wood. "Never learned to make butter proper," Ruth Ann admitted one morning, setting up the butter churn. "But we can't keep eating dry bread." Caleb watched as she poured fresh cream into the wooden barrel. She demonstrated the rhythmic up and down motion with the plunger, then stepped back. "Would you mind? My arms tire quickly with this." He took the churn handle, his powerful arms working the cream with too much force. Cream splashed across the table, making Ruth Ann laugh for the first time since he'd known her. The sound startled them both. "Gentle," she instructed, reaching out to guide his motion. "Like this. Steady and smooth." Their hands touched briefly on the handle, then parted. Caleb adjusted his rhythm, and soon the cream began to thicken. Ruth Ann's smile was warm as sunshine when she praised his effort. The days settled into comfortable patterns. Ruth Ann rose early to bake, while Caleb tended to outdoor chores. They shared meals at the table, the silence between them growing softer. Sometimes she would catch him watching her work, his dark eyes thoughtful instead of wary. One evening, as snow fell in thick curtains outside, Ruth Ann kneaded dough for the next morning's bread. Without thinking, she began to hum an old hymn her mother had taught her. The German words flowed naturally. Großer Gott, wir loben dich. Caleb's whittling knife stilled. He sat straighter in his chair, listening. My wife used to sing, he said suddenly, his voice rough with disuse, in Shoshone, when she worked or walked the trails, didn't understand the words but knew their meaning just the same. Ruth Ann's hands paused in the dough. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife. What happened to her? She asked softly. Fever. 2 winters passed. His knife resumed its steady scraping. Her and our little one? Ruth Ann's heart ached at the pain in his voice. I'm sorry, she whispered. After a moment, she began humming again, letting the old hymn fill the space between their shared grief. Snow sealed them in for 2 days straight. Ruth Ann sewed by the fire, patching Caleb's worn shirts while he whittled small animals from pine, a deer, a rabbit, each one more detailed than the last. The quiet between them felt different now, like a warm blanket rather than a heavy stone. You're good with your hands, Ruth Ann observed, watching him work on a tiny bear. Like my father was with his tools. Caleb nodded, studying the wooden figure. Your father taught you well too. Cooking, sewing, making a home. He paused, then added quietly. Cabin feels different now. Different good? She asked, uncertain. He met her eyes briefly. Different good. Ruth Ann smiled and returned to her sewing. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, the warmth of understanding grew between them like a tender shoot pushing through winter ground. The cabin that had once echoed with Caleb's solitude now hummed with shared purpose and quiet friendship. That evening, as Ruth Ann prepared their supper, she realized she no longer felt like an unwanted burden. Here, in this small mountain cabin, she had found a place where her hands could be useful and her heart could begin to heal. And perhaps, she thought, watching Caleb set his wooden animals along the shelf she'd made, she wasn't the only one finding healing in these quiet days. The morning sun melted the last patches of snow, turning the mountain paths to mud. Caleb saddled his horse while Ruth Ann gathered herbs from her drying strings. She tucked the precious bundles into her apron pockets, not knowing what she might need among the Shoshone. It's 4 hours downriver, Caleb said, helping her mount. His large hands steadied her as she settled sideways on the horse, her plain dress spreading across the saddle. The trail wound through pine forests and along rushing streams. Ruth Ann held tight to the saddle horn as they descended, the horse picking its way carefully down the steep path. Caleb walked beside them, one hand on the bridle, speaking more than usual about his time among the Shoshone. My wife's sister still tends the medicine lodge, he explained. The people there, they're good folk. Taught me much about surviving these mountains. When they reached the camp, children playing by the stream spotted them first. They ran ahead, calling out in Shoshone. Women emerged from hide-covered lodges, their dark eyes taking in the strange pair. Ruth Ann felt their stares as Caleb helped her down. Her plain dress and prayer cap marked her as different, and she heard whispers about her size. Some women turned away, while others watched with undisguised curiosity. A small group gathered around them, speaking rapidly to Caleb in Shoshone. He responded in kind, gesturing to Ruth Ann as he explained their presence. Before anyone could respond, a harsh cough broke through the murmurs. Near one of the lodges, a young mother held a coughing child of perhaps 4 years. The boy's face was flushed with fever, his breathing labored. Ruth Ann recognized the wet sound of chest congestion. Without hesitation, she reached into her apron pocket and withdrew bundles of dried herbs. May I? She asked Caleb. I know a remedy that might help. He spoke to the mother, who hesitated only briefly before nodding. Ruth Ann knelt beside them, her movements gentle despite her size. She asked Caleb to request hot water, then began crushing herbs between her palms, horehound for the cough, elderberry to fight fever, and a pinch of wild cherry bark to ease breathing. The women watched as she mixed the herbs with hot water, creating a poultice. She showed the mother how to place it on the child's chest, demonstrating the proper way to wrap it with cloth. Within minutes, the boy's breathing eased. Word spread quickly through the camp. Soon more mothers approached, pointing to their own children's ailments, a rash here, a sore throat there. Ruth Ann worked steadily, sharing what she knew, showing them how to prepare the remedies themselves. As afternoon faded to evening, children gathered around her by the central fire. She pulled thread and scraps of cloth from her pocket, demonstrating a simple running stitch. Though they couldn't share words, their laughter needed no translation as they practiced threading needles and making crooked stitches. Caleb stood at the edge of the firelight, watching. Ruth Ann's face glowed as she guided small hands, nodding encouragement at their efforts. The women who had first turned away now sat nearby, offering her pieces of dried meat and berries. When the moon rose, it was time to leave. The mother of the sick child pressed a beautifully beaded pouch into Ruth Ann's hands. Others brought small gifts, dried herbs she hadn't seen before, a pair of soft-tanned moccasins that would fit her large feet. The ride home was quiet, broken only by the sound of hooves and the evening songs of birds. Stars emerged one by one, painting the sky with silver light. Ruth Ann held the beaded pouch close, still warm from the fire's glow. "I've never felt useful before," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back home, people only saw my size." "Here," she paused, touching the pouch. "Here they saw what my hands could do." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, leading the horse around a bend in the trail. When he spoke, his voice was gruff but gentle. "Usefulness is better than beauty. Beauty fades. Useful hands build lasting things." Ruth Ann smiled in the darkness, accepting the truth of his words. The stars continued their slow dance overhead as they made their way home to the cabin, where dried herbs hung from the rafters and curtains softened the windows, all proof of useful hands at work. The wooden steps creaked under their boots as Ruth Ann and Caleb climbed back into the shack. The evening air had grown crisp, carrying the first hints of winter's return. Ruth Ann's arms were full of treasures from the Shoshone camp, dried berries, herbs she had never seen before, and most precious of all, a small clay pot of wild honey. "I reckon we earned ourselves a treat," she said, setting her bounty on the rough-hewn table. Her cheeks were still flushed from the day's activities, and her eyes sparkled in the fading light. "Would you fancy some honey cakes?" Caleb nodded, hanging his coat by the door. He watched as Ruth Ann moved confidently around the small space, gathering flour and other supplies. Her large hands worked quickly, mixing ingredients with practiced ease. Soon, the cabin filled with the sweet smell of baking. The lamp cast warm shadows across the walls as they sat down to enjoy the fresh honey cakes. Ruth Ann couldn't help but laugh as Caleb bit into one, honey dripping down his beard. He chuckled too, a rare sound that filled the cabin with unexpected warmth. "These remind me of my mom's baking," Ruth Ann said softly, licking honey from her fingers. "Though she never used wild honey like this." Caleb wiped his beard with the back of his hand. Something shifted in his expression, like clouds parting to reveal sun. "There's something I want to show you," he said, rising from his chair. "Come with me." He lifted the lamp and led Ruth Ann to a narrow ladder that reached into the darkness above. The loft had always been off-limits, and Ruth Ann held her breath as she followed him up. The space was low-ceilinged but dry, filled with boxes and bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb moved to one corner, where a cedar chest sat beneath the sloping roof. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The smell of sage and sweetgrass drifted out, along with memories that made his shoulders tense. Inside lay carefully folded items, beaded moccasins, a fringed dress, and beneath them all, a quilt. Ruth Ann gasped softly as Caleb lifted it out. Even in the dim lamplight, she could see the intricate pattern of stars and mountains worked in blues and browns. "My wife made this," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "Haven't looked at it since." He trailed off, unable to finish. Ruth Ann reached out slowly, her fingers hovering over the fabric. "May I?" At his nod, she gently took the quilt and laid it out on the wooden floor. Her movements were careful, respectful, as she smoothed each corner. The craftsmanship was beautiful. Tiny, even stitches holding together pieces that told a story of love and patience. "Such beauty shouldn't be hidden away in darkness," Ruth Ann said softly. She looked up at Caleb, seeing the wetness in his eyes catch the lamplight. "It wants to give warmth again, like your wife meant it to." Caleb's breath caught. He knelt beside the quilt, running calloused fingers over the familiar patterns. "Haven't touched it in 3 winters," he admitted. "Hurt too much." "Sometimes the things that hurt most need the most light," Ruth Ann said. "Let's bring it downstairs. Let it warm the cabin like she would have wanted." For a long moment, Caleb didn't move. Then slowly, he nodded. Together they carried the quilt down the ladder. Ruth Ann draped it carefully over the back of Caleb's chair, where the lamplight made the colors glow like autumn leaves. That night, Caleb lay in his bed, watching the quilt's shadow dance on the wall. For the first time in years, his dreams of his wife were gentle. He saw her smile, heard her laugh, felt the peace she had brought to his life. When he woke, the grief was still there, but it had softened, like snow beginning to melt. Across the cabin, Ruth Ann knelt beside her bed, her nightdress spreading around her like wings. Her prayers rose in whispered German, asking for healing for 2 hearts wounded by loss. She prayed for Caleb's peace, for his memories to bring comfort instead of pain. And she prayed for herself that she might continue to be useful, to bring warmth to this place that had taken her in. The quilt watched over them both, its patterns holding stories of love past and hope present, as the mountain night wrapped around the cabin like a protective embrace. The late winter sun cast long shadows across the mountain trail as Caleb's horse picked its way down toward the valley. Ruth Ann sat behind him, clutching her newly sewn white cap to keep it from flying away in the brisk wind. She had stayed up late by lamplight for 3 nights to make it perfect, wanting to look proper for her first church meeting in months. "Reckon we're almost there," Caleb said, guiding the horse around a bend. The small white church came into view, its steeple reaching toward the pale blue sky. Already wagons and horses crowded the yard, and the sound of voices drifted up the hill. Ruth Ann's stomach tightened. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," she whispered, remembering the last time she had faced these townspeople. Her fingers unconsciously traced the mended tear in her dress from the auction. Caleb reined the horse to a stop. "You don't have to go in?" "No," Ruth Ann straightened her shoulders. "I do. The Lord gives strength to face our fears." They dismounted, and Ruth Ann smoothed her black dress, adjusted her cap, and took a deep breath. Caleb walked beside her, his tall presence like a shield against the stairs that followed them across the churchyard. Inside, the wooden pews were already filling. Whispers rustled like autumn leaves as they entered. "That's the fat Amish girl from the auction, living up in that cabin with the mountain man. Shame about her uncle selling that good valley land." Ruth Ann kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned. They found seats near the back, where Caleb's broad shoulders blocked some of the curious glances. The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes, took his place at the front. "Let us begin with hymn number 43, he announced, Amazing Grace." Ruth Ann's heart leaped. She knew this one, had sung it countless times in Pennsylvania with her family. As the first uncertain notes rose from the congregation, she closed her eyes and let the familiar words well up from deep inside. Her voice, clear and strong, lifted above the scattered singing. The pure tones filled the small church, reaching into every corner. One by one, the whispers died away. The mockery faded from faces as her voice carried the melody steady and true. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Then something extraordinary happened. Beside her, Caleb's deep bass joined in, rough but sincere. Ruth Ann's eyes flew open in surprise, but she didn't falter. Their voices twined together, his supporting hers like a foundation beneath a house. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. By the final verse, the entire congregation was singing with renewed spirit. Ruth Ann's voice soared above them all, no longer trembling but strong with joy. As the last notes faded into the rafters, a profound silence fell. The preacher's eyes were bright as he began his sermon. Ruth Ann sat straight and tall, her heart too full for shame. She felt Caleb's quiet pride beside her, solid as mountain stone. After the service, several women approached hesitantly. The baker's wife spoke first. "That was beautiful singing, miss," she said. "We haven't had such a voice in our choir since Mrs. Peterson passed." "Thank you," Ruth Ann replied softly. "I learned in our Amish services back home." "I heard tell you know something about baking too," another woman ventured. "And quilting?" "Yeah, I do both," Ruth Ann smiled. "Would you like to trade recipes, perhaps?" Soon a small circle had formed, women asking about her bread, her stitching, her herb knowledge. The mockery had transformed into genuine interest. Ruth Ann answered each question with growing confidence, her natural warmth drawing them in. Caleb stood back, watching. He saw how the townspeople's attitudes shifted, saw Ruth Ann bloom under their acceptance like a flower turning toward the sun. But his jaw remained tight, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had noticed Railroad Agent Kerr watching from the church steps, his calculating gaze fixed on Ruth Ann as she chatted with the townswomen. The ride home was quiet, but a different kind of quiet than their journey down. Ruth Ann sat straighter behind Caleb, humming softly as they climbed back into the mountains. The afternoon sun caught her face, showing a joy he had never seen there before. "I never thought they'd accept me," she said finally. After what happened. But God opens hearts through music. That's what my mom always said." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, knowing the railroad's plans threatened this newfound peace. But he couldn't bear to dim the happiness in her voice. Not today. Not when she had found her courage to stand before those who had once mocked her. "You showed them who you truly are," he said simply. "That's worth more than any amount of land." Ruth Ann's soft hum carried them home through the gathering dusk, while far below, the valley lay quiet, holding its secrets about battles yet to come. 3 days after the church gathering, Ruth Ann hummed while kneading bread dough in Caleb's cabin. The warmth from the wood stove had steamed up the windows, creating a cozy barrier against the late winter chill. Her fingers worked the soft dough with practiced ease, her heart still light from the memory of singing hymns. The thunder of approaching hooves shattered the peaceful afternoon. Ruth Ann wiped her hands on her apron and peered through the frosted glass. Her breath caught at the sight of her uncle's familiar slouched figure among a group of mounted men. "No," she whispered, stumbling back from the window. "Dear Lord, no!" Caleb burst through the door, rifle in hand. "Get to the back room," he ordered, his voice tight with urgency. Before Ruth Ann could move, her uncle's angry voice carried through the wooden walls. "That's the place. The mountain man's got her up here, hiding from justice." Heavy boots pounded up the porch steps. The door crashed open, splintering near its hinges as railroad men poured into the cabin. Ruth Ann recognized Agent Kerr's polished appearance among the rough group, his smile cold as winter frost. "There she is," her uncle spat, pointing a crooked finger. "Ungrateful girl, running from her debts." Caleb moved like lightning, his fist connecting with the first man who reached for Ruth Ann. The cabin erupted into chaos. Bodies slammed against walls, overturning her carefully arranged shelves. The bread bowl clattered to the floor, dough scattering like snow. "Stop this!" Ruth Ann screamed as 3 men grabbed Caleb's arms. He fought like a grizzly, throwing them off, but more kept coming. A lantern shattered, spilling oil across her clean floors. "Caleb Brandt," Agent Kerr announced with smooth satisfaction. "You are under arrest for assaulting company representatives and harboring a fugitive from debt." The mountain man's strength finally gave out against overwhelming numbers. They forced his hands behind his back, iron manacles clicking shut around his wrists. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, where someone had struck him with a pistol butt. "He's done nothing wrong." Ruth Ann tried to reach him, but her uncle grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the same spot he'd gripped at the auction. She yanked away, stomach churning at his touch. "Now, Miss Stoltzfus," Agent Kerr straightened his vest, brushing off dirt from the scuffle. "Let's discuss this reasonably. Your uncle legally sold that valley land to the railroad. All we need is your signature to finalize the transfer." "I won't sign." Ruth Ann's voice shook but held firm. "That land belonged to my parents." "Then Mr. Brandt here will face serious charges." Kerr's smile never wavered. "Assault, theft, perhaps even kidnapping. The territorial judge takes a harsh view of such crimes." Ruth Ann watched helplessly as they dragged Caleb towards the door. His eyes met hers, dark with fury and something deeper, fear for her safety, not his own. "Don't sign," he growled. "No matter what." A blow to his ribs cut off his words. "Think it over carefully, Miss Stoltzfus." Agent Kerr tipped his hat. "We'll expect your answer tomorrow at the sheriff's office. Your signature for Mr. Brandt's freedom. A fair trade, wouldn't you say?" They hauled Caleb out into the gathering dusk. Ruth Ann ran to the doorway, her heart breaking as they forced him onto a horse. His broad shoulders were bowed but unbeaten, even in chains. "You brought this on yourself," her uncle sneered as he mounted up. "Should have stayed sold at that auction where you belonged." Ruth Ann stood frozen until the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, their torches becoming distant fireflies in the darkness. Only then did her legs give way. She sank to her knees beside Caleb's bloodied coat, which had been torn from him in the fight. The cabin felt vast and empty, like a church stripped of its altar. Blood spots stained her swept floors. Broken crockery crunched under her feet. The spilled lamp oil gleamed in the fading light, and the scent of her ruined bread filled the air with mockery of the home she had tried to create. Outside, snow began to fall, thick flakes swirling past the broken door. Cold crept in, but Ruth Ann barely felt it. She clutched Caleb's coat to her chest, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and leather, now tainted with blood. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, her prayers rising like smoke. "Please, Lord, don't let them take him too. Everyone I love is taken from me." The wind whistled through the cabin's broken door, scattering her prayers into the night. Ruth Ann knelt in the growing darkness, alone again, just as she had been on the auction block. But this time, no silent mountain man would step from the crowd to save her. Snow continued to fall, erasing the tracks of violence that led down the mountain, while Ruth Ann wept in the ruins of her almost home. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pale gold. Ruth Ann had not slept. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she forced herself to rise from where she had kept vigil through the night. The cabin felt hollow without Caleb's steady presence. The hearth had gone cold during her hours of prayer. With trembling hands, she laid fresh kindling and struck a match. The small flame flickered, threatening to die, much like her hope, but Ruth Ann cupped her hands around it, protecting the spark until it caught and grew stronger. "Just like Ma'am taught me," she whispered, her voice rough from tears. "Life goes on. The fire must be tended." Tears streamed down her face as she worked, but she refused to stop. She swept up the broken crockery from yesterday's violence, straightened the overturned furniture, and scrubbed the bloodstains from the wooden floor. Each task felt like a silent rebellion against despair. The dough bowl lay where it had fallen. Ruth Ann picked it up, running her fingers over a new crack in its rim. She remembered Caleb watching her knead bread that first morning, his quiet appreciation of her skills warming her more than any fire. "I won't let this place go cold," she promised the empty cabin. She measured flour, salt, and yeast with shaking hands. The familiar motions of mixing and kneading steadied her spirit, though tears still fell into the dough. Mid-morning, horse hooves crunched in the snow outside. Ruth Ann's heart leaped, but it wasn't Caleb. Thomas Wheeler, a kind-faced man from town who had smiled at her singing in church, stood awkwardly on the porch. "Miss Stoltzfus." He removed his hat, revealing worry in his eyes. "There's a telegram come to the trading post about Mr. Brandt. I thought you should know right away." Ruth Ann's fingers clutched her apron. "What does it say?" "They're holding him in the territorial jail. The railroad's pressing charges." Thomas hesitated. "They're saying he'll hang for attacking company men. Trial's set for next week." The world tilted beneath Ruth Ann's feet. She steadied herself against the doorframe, forcing air into her lungs. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Wheeler. Is the telegram at the post?" "Yes'm, if you want to read it yourself." Ruth Ann nodded. "I'll come down. Just let me bank the fire." After Thomas rode away, Ruth Ann wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl. The walk to the trading post would be long and cold, but she had to see those words with her own eyes, had to know exactly what threat they held over Caleb's life. The trail wound down the mountainside like a white ribbon. Ruth Ann's boots crunched through fresh snow, each step an effort. The same path she had walked with Caleb now seemed endless alone. Wind cut through her shawl, but she pressed on, one foot after another. At the trading post, the telegraph operator handed her the yellow paper with gentle sympathy. Ruth Ann's fingers trembled as she read the typed words. "Caleb Brandt held for assault on railroad agents. Stop trial date set. 20th. Stop hanging verdict expected. Stop signature on deed only remedy stop." The paper crumpled in her fist. The railroad's message was clear. Sign away her family's land, or Caleb would die. Just like at the auction block, they thought they could force her hand through shame and fear. The walk back up the mountain seemed even longer. Ruth Ann's legs ached, and her lungs burned in the thin air. But with each labored step, determination grew stronger in her heart. She would not let them win. Not this time. Night had fallen by the time she reached the cabin. The bread she had left to rise had collapsed, but Ruth Ann barely noticed. She lit the lamp and went straight to the shelf where Caleb kept his few books. Among them was a leather-bound Bible, dusty from disuse. She remembered him touching it once, saying it had belonged to his wife. Ruth Ann carried it to the table and opened it carefully. The pages crackled, stiff from years of silence. She began to read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each verse from the Psalms. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The familiar words filled the lonely cabin. Ruth Ann read until her voice grew hoarse, drawing courage from each promise of deliverance. Though her hands still shook, steel entered her spine. "I will not sign," she declared to the silent room. "Not even to save him. Caleb would never want his life bought with stolen land." The decision felt both terrible and right. Ruth Ann knew it might cost Caleb's life, the life of the man who had saved her, who had given her dignity and purpose again. But to yield to the railroad's threats would betray everything both of them believed in. She kept the Bible open before her as she knelt to pray, her forehead pressed against its worn pages. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in a territorial jail, Caleb waited. But Ruth Ann's tears had finally stopped. In their place was something stronger, the quiet certainty that faith would light their way through this darkest hour. Iron shackles bit into Caleb Brandt's wrists as he sat on the cold floor of his jail cell. 3 days had passed since the railroad men had dragged him from his cabin. 3 days of Sheriff Bridger's sneering face appearing at the barred window, taunting him with news from town. "Your fat Amish girl still ain't signed them papers," Bridger drawled, jingling his keys. "Reckon she thinks you're worth holding out for. Ain't that sweet?" Caleb said nothing, but his shoulders tensed. The raw skin around his wrists stung as he shifted position. "You know what I can't figure?" Bridger continued, leaning against the cell door. "What made a mountain brute like you care about defending her in the first place? She ain't exactly a prize." Caleb's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Getting angry wouldn't help Ruth Ann. Still, the urge to slam the sheriff's head against those bars grew stronger with each passing hour. The jail grew quiet as evening approached. Outside, horses clip-clopped through the muddy street. Caleb had almost dozed off when soft footsteps approached his cell. "Brother-in-law," came a familiar voice, speaking in Shoshone. Caleb's head snapped up. Chief Running Elk stood before the bars, his face grave in the dim lamplight. "How did you get in here?" Caleb whispered. "The deputy sleeps deeply after too much whiskey," Running Elk replied with a slight smile. "We must speak quickly." The chief's dark eyes studied Caleb's chains. "These bonds shame them more than you, brother. No person should be owned, not woman, not land." "They'll hang me next week," Caleb said hoarsely, "unless Ruth Ann signs away her valley." Running Elk nodded. "So I have heard, but there is another path." From beneath his blanket, he drew out a metal file, passing it through the bars. "Justice without revenge, brother, that is the way." Caleb stared at the file in his hands. "If I break free, they'll hunt me down. Call me an outlaw. Better an outlaw standing for right than a dead man serving wrong," Running Elk said firmly. "The girl shows courage refusing to sign. Will you show less?" Rage and uncertainty warred in Caleb's chest. Part of him wanted to tear through the town with gun blazing, make them all pay for their cruelty. But Ruth Ann's gentle faith rose in his memory, her quiet strength as she faced mockery, her prayers in the firelight. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to show mercy," Caleb admitted. Running Elk touched his shoulder through the bars. "Strength comes in many forms, brother. Sometimes the strongest path is to fight without hatred." Caleb's fingers closed around the file. "You'll help?" "My fastest horses wait in the trees beyond town," Running Elk confirmed. "When the moon is highest, we ride." The hours crept by like molasses. Caleb worked the file against his chains whenever the guard's snores grew loudest, wrapping his blanket around the metal to muffle the sound. By midnight, his wrists were free, though raw and bleeding. Running Elk appeared like a shadow, unlocking the cell with stolen keys. They crept through the sleeping jail, past the drunk deputy sprawled across his desk. The cool night air hit Caleb's face like a blessing as they emerged into the street. They reached the horses without raising an alarm. As Caleb swung into the saddle, something broke loose in his chest. Words he hadn't spoken in years spilled from his lips. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "Help me do right by her." Running Elk, mounted beside him, nodded in approval. "Mercy is stronger than any rifle, brother. Remember that when dawn comes." They rode hard through the darkness, hooves thundering against the packed earth. The valley lay ahead, where Ruth Ann's land waited, where another auction threatened to steal more than just property. Caleb's wrists stung with every movement, but he barely noticed the pain. His thoughts were filled with Ruth Ann, her quiet dignity, her transforming presence in his home. He wouldn't let them shame her again. "We'll make it right," he muttered into the wind. "God help me, we'll make it right." Running Elk rode close beside him, Both men bent low over their horses' necks as they raced toward the coming dawn. Toward justice that required not just courage, but mercy. Toward a confrontation that would test everything Caleb had learned about faith and forgiveness. The stars wheeled overhead as they pressed onward, two riders moving like shadows through the night. Behind them, the town slept unaware. Ahead lay the valley, and whatever morning would bring. The first pale light of dawn painted the mountains gold as two railroad men pounded on the cabin door. Ruth Ann had been awake for hours, kneeling in prayer. She rose slowly, smoothing her plain dress and adjusting her freshly pressed white cap. Her fingers trembled, but her voice remained steady. "I am coming." They marched her down the mountain path, their boots crushing the frost-covered grass. Ruth Ann clutched her father's worn Bible to her chest, drawing strength from its familiar leather binding. The morning air bit through her thin dress, but she walked with her head high. The town square filled quickly as word spread. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores, miners abandoned their breakfasts, and women gathered on porches to watch. Ruth Ann recognized faces from the church gathering where she had sung, now twisted with curiosity or cruel anticipation. Railroad Agent Kerr stood on the wooden platform where she had first been humiliated. His polished boots gleamed in the morning light. Beside him, Sheriff Bridger twirled his mustache, a smirk playing across his face. "Bring her up," Kerr commanded. Rough hands pushed Ruth Ann toward the platform steps. She climbed them one at a time, each board creaking under her weight. Someone in the crowd called out, "The fat Amish girl's back for another showing." Laughter rippled through the gathering. Ruth Ann's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed ahead. Agent Kerr thrust a stack of papers toward her. "Sign these deeds," he demanded, "or we'll auction you off proper this time. No mountain man to save you today." Ruth Ann looked at the papers, then at the jeering crowd. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but a deeper strength flowed through her veins, the same courage that had helped her survive these past weeks alone. "No," she said clearly. Sheriff Bridger stepped forward, hand resting on his gun belt. "Now listen here, girl. Your uncle already sold that land. This is just a formality. Sign, or things will get mighty unpleasant." Ruth Ann opened her father's Bible, its pages worn smooth by years of faithful hands. Her voice rang out across the square. "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." The crowd's taunts faltered. Ruth Ann turned a page, reading with quiet conviction. "The land must not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers." More voices fell silent. Even Agent Kerr seemed momentarily thrown by her calm defiance. But Sheriff Bridger's face darkened with rage. "Enough of this foolishness!" He grabbed for her arm. The thunder of hoofbeats split the morning air. Two riders burst into the square, Caleb Brandt and Chief Running Elk, their horses lathered with sweat. Caleb's rifle gleamed in the dawn light, but he held it pointed skyward. Railroad men drew their weapons. The crowd scattered for cover as Caleb dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with purpose. His wrists were raw and bleeding, but his stance was steady as he approached the platform. "Step away from her," he growled. Agent Kerr sneered. "Or what? You'll add murder to your crimes? Look around, Brandt. You're outnumbered." Indeed, more railroad men emerged from the shadows, rifles raised. Chief Running Elk remained mounted, watching the scene with grave intensity. Ruth Ann's heart leaped at seeing Caleb alive, but fear gripped her as guns leveled at his chest. "Please," she whispered, "no more violence." Caleb met her eyes. Something had changed in his face, a softening around the edges, a light where darkness had dwelled. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle. "Mercy wins," he declared, loud enough for all to hear. Sheriff Bridger barked a laugh. "Mercy? That's weakness talking. Take him." But Chief Running Elk's voice cut through the tension. "Is it weak to spare a man who would kill you?" Is it weak to defend without hatred? The chief's words seemed to hover in the morning air. Ruth Ann stood straighter, still holding her Bible. God's mercy is not weakness, she added softly. It is the strongest force in all creation. Something shifted in the crowd. Women who had mocked now looked uncomfortable. Men who had jeered found themselves unable to meet Ruth Ann's steady gaze. Her simple faith, her quiet dignity in the face of cruelty, stirred something long buried in their hearts. Caleb stepped onto the platform, placing himself between Ruth Ann and the sheriff. His empty hands spoke louder than any weapon. "This ends now," he said. "Not with bullets or blood, but with truth." The morning sun crested the mountains, flooding the square with golden light. Ruth Ann's white cap glowed like a beacon of hope, her Bible still pressed to her heart. Beside her stood Caleb, unarmed but unafraid, while Chief Running Elk watched from horseback. 3 cultures united in a moment of choosing between violence and grace. The rifles remained raised, the tension wire-tight, as dawn painted the sky in colors of judgment and mercy. Agent Kerr's face twisted with rage. He lunged forward, grabbing for Ruth Ann's Bible with greedy fingers. "Give me that foolish book, girl!" But something had changed in the watching crowd. Preacher Wilson stepped forward, his weathered face stern. "That's enough, Agent Kerr. The good book speaks true about stolen land." Other voices joined in. Farmer Jensen, who had laughed at Ruth Ann weeks ago, pushed to the front. "My pa always said railroad men were thieves in fancy coats. This here valley belongs to honest folk. The Stoltzfus family worked that land fair," called out Miller Thompson. "Ain't right to take it through trickery." More townspeople pressed forward. Shopkeepers, farmers, even miners who had once mocked Ruth Ann's plain ways. Their faces showed shame, mixed with determination. Sheriff Bridger's grip on Ruth Ann's arm loosened as he looked at the changing crowd. His authority was slipping away like morning mist. With a muttered curse, he stepped back, adjusting his gun belt nervously. Ruth Ann's uncle, red-faced and sweating, backed away from the platform. Seeing his schemes crumble, he turned and fled down an alley, leaving only dust and disgrace behind. Caleb moved forward, his arms opening wide. Ruth Ann fell into his embrace, her Bible pressed between them. They stood trembling together, but not from fear, from the power of acceptance washing over them. The same men who had jeered at Ruth Ann's size now nodded respectfully, seeing her strength and dignity at last. "The railroad's got no claim here," Preacher Wilson declared. "Not when good people stand together." Agent Kerr surveyed the hostile faces surrounding him. His polished manner cracked like thin ice. With a sharp gesture to his men, he gathered his papers. "This valley isn't worth the trouble," he spat, but his retreat was hasty. As the morning sun warmed the square, Caleb held Ruth Ann close. His rough whisper carried years of loneliness finally ending. "You were never unwanted?" Ruth Ann's eyes shone with joyful tears as she looked up at him. "We were chosen," she replied softly. "By God's grace, we were chosen for each other." The crowd began to disperse, but something precious remained, respect born from courage and community restored through mercy rather than might. Spring sunlight danced across the valley, turning patches of melting snow into glittering pools. The old Stoltzfus homestead stirred with new life as Ruth Ann and Caleb worked side by side, their hands deep in the awakening earth. "The soil remembers," Ruth Ann said softly, crumbling rich dirt between her fingers. "Just like my mom taught me." Caleb carried wooden beehives to the southern slope, where wildflowers would soon carpet the ground. His strong hands moved with gentle care, positioning each box just so. Ruth Ann watched him work, marveling at how naturally he took to beekeeping. As days lengthened, their home became a gathering place. Shoshone families brought dried berries and fresh game, sharing meals around the sturdy oak table Ruth Ann's father had built. Children played in the yard, while women exchanged recipes and healing wisdom. The cabin walls, once silent, now echoed with multiple languages and warm laughter. Each evening, lamplight spilled from windows onto the new porch. Ruth Ann's clear voice lifted in hymns, while Caleb's deeper tones joined in, their harmony floating across the valley. The hearth fire cast dancing shadows as they sat together, finding peace in shared silence and quiet conversation. One spring evening, Ruth Ann spread her finished quilt across their bed. Patches of her mother's Amish dress lay next to squares from Caleb's late wife's shawl. New cloth from town stores brought bright touches of color, binding their separate lives into one beautiful whole. See how the pieces fit? Ruth Ann smoothed the fabric with work-worn hands. Different, but stronger together. Caleb's fingers found hers, rough palm against soft skin. Like us, he said simply. Ruth Ann leaned against his shoulder, watching sunset paint the valley gold. I used to hide myself away, she whispered, ashamed of being too much, too plain, too different. But here, she gestured to their home, to the hives humming with life, to the gardens beginning to sprout. Here I am simply who God made me to be. Outside their window, bees drifted lazy circles over the first wildflowers of spring. Purple lupine and yellow daisies nodded in the gentle breeze. Ruth Ann and Caleb stood together in the doorway of their home, their joined hands a bridge between past and future, their hearts full of quiet joy. Their love, like the valley itself, had bloomed from faith, courage, and the healing touch of grace. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.